Yeah, let's talk about simplified liquidation. So now that we've seen this draft bill, but the regulations are yet to be released. Um, we've previously given a review of the debtor in possession model, but the second arm to these reforms really is the simplified liquidation.
That's right.
It's interesting, when I was reading the explanatory memorandum to the proposed legislation, it makes it really clear from the outset that the purpose is to address what really is a one-size-fits-all system.
Absolutely.
So they want to, break through those barriers of high cost, lengthy processes, which are a real deterrent to small businesses, but the small business directors and office holders who perhaps are a little bit reluctant or a lot reluctant to engage with the insolvency system. And timing is everything. When you finally do have office holders who realise we've got no alternative but to speak to either a lawyer practicing in insolvency or going straight to the IP, which is the insolvency practitioner, it's often already too late. So I think these reforms, well, I know these reforms from reading that EM are really trying to break through and encourage early engagement with the system. And for that to occur for smaller businesses, and remember the eligibility requirements for these simplified liquidation procedures must have liabilities of less than 1 million. So we are talking about the smaller scale external administrations. We really want them to engage as early as possible to increase the opportunity to restructure and survive this period. So like your Part 5.3 capital A, which is your voluntary administration under the Corporations Act. And I remember when that all came in back in the early 90s. It's designed to give the company the opportunity to trade through. Key difference here is that opportunity is available while the director remains in control of the company. But with the simplified liquidation, so that's your debtor in possession model, your restructuring plan. There's also simplified liquidations available, and the eligibility requirements are the same, aren't they, Alice?
I think, yes, they are. As they've set down in the draft legislation, they haven't necessarily spelled out in both sections that they are identical, but they have alluded to the fact that they want to make sure that there's consistency between both of them.
Which makes
sense. But it's also a little bit confusing because we're not yet sure whether, if a restructuring plan fails, whether a company can still use the simplified regime or whether it has to go through a full liquidation, but that remains to be seen. But I think it's safe to say that by the time everything sort of gets solidified, the tests, eligibility tests for both the restructuring plan and the simplified regime will be incredibly similar, if not identical.
Yeah, which makes it easier for the advisors. So I'm happy with that.
I'm glad you're happy with that.
Let's talk about what's simple about it. So if we're talking about, if the objective is to reduce the costs, to make it look more readily available or palatable to the directors making that decision, why is it a reduced cost? What's simple about it?
I'm probably not the best person to ask about this question because, quite frankly, from the practical elements of a creditor's voluntary liquidation, I don't see there being a huge amount of cost-reducing elements in the simplified regime. Basically, they're saying that we don't have to call any meetings of creditors, but we don't have to anyway, as it stands in an ordinary CVL. Most people don't call meetings of creditors. We have flying minutes. We still need to issue our statutory reporting to creditors, so that'll be the same. In fact, there may be more because we will need to notify creditors that we're wanting to go into a simplified regime. So instead of being 2 statutory reporting requirements, there may very well be 3.
Oh, because they've got there's that period of time where you say it's going to be a simplified liquidation, and then if there's a vote of 25% or more creditors who are not happy with that, and that might only be one creditor that holds 25% of the value of the creditors, then that goes back to the liquidator, and all of a sudden the simplified liquidation is off the table, and it transitions, or it becomes a full-scale liquidation.
It just remains, the full-scale liquidation, that's right. We don't have to do a 533 report to ASIC. So what that is, that's a confidential report that a liquidator must do in respect of a liquidation where there's either going to be less than 50 cents in the dollar returned to creditors, or where offences have been identified in that liquidation. And we report to ASIC in relation to insolvent trading, potential criminal offences, breaches of directors' duties, those sorts of things. So we don't have to do that report, but that doesn't mean that the investigations behind the information that goes into that report doesn't need to be done, because if you actually look at the requirements for the statutory reporting to creditors, we still need to report on avoidable transactions, whether there's been sort of certain other areas of misconduct that have been identified. So again, I'm not entirely sure that there's
You're still doing the work, you're just not telling us.
That's right, we're just not telling ASIC. That's pretty much it. There's also basically you can't have a reviewing liquidator appointed in the simplified regime, which is where creditors may not be happy with certain elements of a liquidator's work in a liquidation, so they can apply to have another liquidator appointed to review certain elements of the file. I don't see that happening in a lot of matters anyway, let alone in small business liquidation. So I don't know that that's really going to have a huge impact in the overall cost-saving measures for the simplified regime. And finally, there already exists, I think it's section 545 of the Corporations Act, which says the liquidator doesn't have to do anything. That basically means that it incurs costs where there isn't costs in the liquidation to pay for it. So we sort of already have a little bit of a get out there insofar as not having to do certain things. I mean, we still need to do our statutory requirements, and it's very specific that we still need to do a 533 report. So that is a change. But quite frankly, I don't see a huge amount of cost saving from the simplified regime.
What about, and this is a key one and generated a lot of discussion, for me it feels like a real disconnect between one of the overriding objectives, which is to reduce the cost of the simplified liquidation procedure so that there is a corresponding potential increase in the return, both to creditors and maybe even a shareholder. That doesn't very frequently happen. But simplifying the liquidation by reducing the circumstances in which a liquidator can seek to claw back an unfair preference from a creditor that is not related to the company. So it looks like these simplified procedures means that the liquidator is not going to have those same powers under the voidable transactions provisions within the current the Corporations Act now. But when I talk about a disconnect, what I'm getting at is a lot of the time those recoveries that a liquidator makes are ultimately how funds come into the liquidation and what leads to a potential dividend being declared. I mean, look, straight away, what first comes to mind is those preference payments that the Australian Taxation Office receives in that 6-month period prior to a liquidation. It's kind of the low-hanging fruit, and if that recovery isn't available for a liquidator in an SL, then that's a potential significant source of money that would have otherwise come into a liquidation. So it's interesting.
I think you find also, I was going to say, I think you find also that the policy behind, or not the policy, but the sort of thought behind not attacking preferences in a simplified regime may have come about by not wanting to penalise other small businesses that were merely trying to collect their debts through the process. So it's about sort of robbing Peter to pay Paul. And, I've seen, luckily I've not had to do it myself, but I've actually seen liquidators wind up other companies for non-payments of preferences.
Yeah.
Where there's been orders given and judgments given, and that amount hasn't been able to be paid. So it sort of really, puts into perpetuity this almost like one of those babushka dolls where the liquidation just begets more liquidations.
Yeah.
And I think that there's a real issue the government's trying to protect around that. It's like, okay, well, if it's not really in the public interest to recover and everyone's sort of happy, let's just leave the status quo. And I to a certain extent, I get that. But what you said before is correct. The vast majority of preferences come from the tax office. So realistically, and I know that they have said that there's certain criteria behind those. So whether it is the fact that it might be a preference in relation to a trade creditor, or I don't know what that's going to look like. As we keep saying, we'll have to wait for the regulations.
Yeah.
But I do think that there'll be significant base tax office preferences that do go to fund the liquidation and do also go back to paying ordinary unsecured creditors.
Absolutely.
From that amount. So it sort of seems like a bit of a David and Goliath, and I don't know where that will turn. Now, we've been saying the whole time as well that both the simplified regime and the debt restructuring regime will depend, the success of those will depend on what the tax office wants to do.
Yeah.
Now, I would suggest the tax office policy would normally be to vote against most of those things, just in line with its normal compliance regimes and how it's been voting for a very long time in these matters. I don't know that there's a policy decision, but, from my experience, you need to show exceptional potential for change before the tax office will accept an agreement or a compromise with debt. But if going into a simplified liquidation means that they're not going to have preferences attacked, then that might actually be really attractive to them to be able to allow that to happen.
We've talked about it only requiring 25% of creditors in value to say to a liquidator who's proposed an SL, no, go to your normal liquidation processes. What's the likelihood of the ATO? Well, there's two points there, I suppose. One, the ATO is going to be in favour of a simplified liquidation. It gives itself a measure of protection from that preference recovery. But then, of course, you've got the liquidator who, if on the books, can see that the ATO has received significant payments over the last 6 months, is not going to promote or engage with the simplified liquidation process anyway.
I think that's really valid. I think that's a really valid point.
Yeah. So again, factors which are really going to impact upon the take-up of these new reforms or these particular regimes. You've got a liquidator who's only going to say, okay, well, this simplified liquidation process is going to work, but probably if the ATO is a factor, it probably not, because as we talked about, the potential preference recovery from the Australian Taxation Office is often one of the main sources of recoveries for a liquidator.